Let's return to This Week in America. Here's your host, Rick Bratton.
Welcome back, everybody, coast to coast, This Week in America. Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell by Roger Johnson is a multifaceted memoir that centers on Roger's relationship with his father. Both military pilots, airline pilots, both began to fly in their teens. Embedded in the story is the genesis of Roger's Christian faith, which helped him survive the abuse within his family and also shaped and helped him achieve dreams of aviation splendor beyond which he ever thought he could achieve. Due to being the adult child of an alcoholic, Roger too had dysfunctions that were masked by his flying life in which he flew to escape the reality of who he had become. Roger is a second-generation military and airline pilot. The youngest of three children, started flying at 15, towed banners down the South Jersey Shore beaches during the summer of his college years. He went on to the United States Air Force and the Air National Guard, became an F-4 fighter weapons Top Gun instructor after he went on to fly F-16s. In 1988, he went into the airlines where he became a captain. This is his first book. It took 30 years to write due to the complexity of the topics embedded within it. Roger Johnson, author of Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell, is with us on This Week in America. Roger, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks. Appreciate it.
This is such an inspiring book as we go with you through all of your life. And people who have read the book, the reviews are excellent, talking about your writing sort of takes us into your life. We feel like you're there as you go through the ups and downs of life. Let's talk about the inspiration to write the book. Obviously, it was difficult. Obviously, it took a number of years to do it. What was the inspiration to write this book, Weathering Storms?
You know, it actually started 30 years ago when I started with the airline, so it's really 32 years ago now. I love to read aviation stuff, and I'd never found an aviation book that really, to me, put you in the airplane with the pilot. And I'm not talking about how to start an airplane, but I mean just all the different facets of flying and being in the airplane and flying the trips and stuff like that. I mean, there are some good books out there. I'm not going to say there aren't, but there just didn't seem to be that many. So somebody said, why don't you write a book about your flying stories? And I thought, that's a great idea. So originally, 30 years ago, as the book started to develop, it was nothing but flying stories, all short stories of flights I'd taken, flights of fancy, flights of fun, military flights. And as I started to collect all the stories, I gave it to some friends of mine, particularly a couple of women I know. And they're like, it's all right, but it's more for pilots. I'm not, as a woman, I really don't want to read it. I want human interest. So I started to put the stories together with a human interest slant. And then somebody said, somebody that knows me very well said, you've had an interesting life with your father growing up. Why don't you incorporate your father in it, because he's obviously a pilot too. So I started doing that. And over the course of writing the book, I lost a child in 1997. That broke up my marriage, got divorced. And, and then all the abuse that went on when I was a kid. So it really, over 30 years, it morphed from just a book about short stories of flying to really about the relationship with my father and I, and through advice from some people. And I am a Christian, although that's been developing through the years too. And I know, most friends that are Christian nowadays, people draw back and say, don't say that word. But, a true Christian is a really good person, and they're not the hypocrites that you see a lot of times in certain areas of the country. But anyway, going off topic there.
Well, no, I understand exactly what you're talking about. Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. And I just didn't, so in the book then so it is now what it is. It's a comprehensive look at my life of flying with my father and I. My father was my greatest hero. He was a great pilot. He was an outstanding pilot. He instructed me when I first learned to fly, and truly, I had flown with a lot of instructors in my life in a lot of different airplanes, and my father, without question, is the finest. He truly was angelic in an airplane, but he was an alcoholic, got drunk almost 360 out of 365 days out of the year. He never flew when he was drunk, as far as I knew. But when he was home, he would drink, and by 9 o'clock in the evening, he was drunk. And he was initially, when I was little, extremely abusive to my mother, beat her. There's one point where he was choking her to death, and I am absolutely sure, had I not stabbed him in the back with a pair of scissors, that he would have killed my mom. And eventually their fighting led over. As I got older, my dad stopped being physically abusive with my mom, but then he started becoming abusive to me physically and emotionally for whatever reasons, I don't know. So, it was literally a house of hell. And my dad used flying to escape. And eventually, as I got older, I acquired some issues, not abusive issues with women or any of that stuff. I always respected them greatly and still obviously do. But when it came to just having emotional issues, I acquired them because of growing up in the house of hell. And flying was my big escape.
Roger Johnson is our guest on the program. He's the author of the book, Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell. You'll find it at Amazon, the usual places. Link on by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. And it's interesting because you really couldn't tell your aviation story without your family story, could you? The relationship with your father.
No, exactly. You could not. They are, we are intertwined like vines growing up a pole.
And as you read, you will find the connection there. And I mentioned so much of the background of both military pilots, both airline pilots. You talk about some of the issues that you had to deal with at home. How difficult what was the hardest part of writing this book for you? Because you really lay out there some very personal problems, difficult issues that you went through.
It's funny. As I wrote the book, and particularly towards the end, the last 5 years of writing it, it became a love-hate relationship because there's great flying stories in it. Like, I was an instructor in Air Force Fighter Weapons School, which is the Air Force's version of Navy Top Gun. And I lay out some really good stories in there. But as I recall, when I was writing the stories about my Top Gun flying, and I was an instructor also in that school, I was in a personal hell because relationship-wise with women, I just wanted I just wanted to consume women sexually. Some of my buddies were like, just a fighter pilot. No, there was something wrong with me. But so that part was difficult to write about. The hardest part with that question that took me a year to write was the death of my daughter. In 1997, my wife at the time accidentally backed over and killed our 17-month-old daughter. It was an accident. She was backing up, and Autumn Page ran behind her, and my wife did not see her and ran over and killed her. I actually held Autumn Page as she died in my arms in the front yard of our house. They called the paramedics, the air evac to the Labana hospital, but she died, en route. And there's nothing. I mean, literally, she did die in my arms. I saw her skin color go from pink to ashen, and that part alone was just extremely hard to write about.
Oh, yes.
So, and there is a follow-on to that I include in the book about another issue that reminded me of Autumn Page that I do include in the book, and it's about a fella who thought he lost his son in an airplane crash, and I was actually flying over the crash site at 37,000 feet, and I answered his mayday call about his son, crashing his airplane. But, in the book, that has got more of a happy ending than mine.
I don't know how you ever get over something like that, especially the circumstances and the loss of a child. And just one of the many stories that you'll read about, and the title is Flying Between Heaven and Hell, Weathering Storms. Roger Johnson is our guest on the program. Who is the book designed for? Who do you think should read this book? Because there's so many, they're entertaining stories with the flight part of it, and there's stories that so many people can relate to of just dealing with obstacles in life and trying to overcome those and find happiness.
You know, it's funny. I have been shocked by how many women have read it. And I mean, I thought it would probably be picked up by mostly guys who want to read about flying. A lot of guys don't really care about the drama part with, what went on in my life. A lot of friends of mine that have read it said, yeah, geez, man, you never know the way you are that you went through that hell. I mean, but I think it's really, to me, it's good for everybody, but that sounds like me trying to promote my book to sell every copy I can possibly get. But I will be honest with you, and this is really, as the book progressed in my life, I decided to include my faith in it. Now, it is not a book, it's not a Bible-throwing book. When you read it, you're going to get Bible verses everywhere, and you shall be this, and you should be this, because
Right.
God knows I have done more bad things in my life than this book even goes into. So my point with the faith is like my mom taught me the Lord's Prayer at 7 years old. I didn't know what it was. To me, it was just a bunch of words, but she said, please say this once I memorized it, she said, say this every day. And my mom never exhibited any Christian leanings, and we didn't go to church except, Christmas and Easter. I mean, that's but all through my life, my faith, I feel, when you are beat to death by your father, not obviously to death, but beat so much down to where you think you're worthless and you're going to be in a prison or dead by the time you're 18, you think you'll have no career, to where I went from being almost like I was the bottom 10% of my high school graduating class in grades, and I graduated with honors from a 4-year college in New England, and went on to fly F-4s, F-16s, and be an instructor at one of the most elite military schools, fighter weapons school, and then to go on the airlines and fly a 777 as a captain. I didn't do that on my own. So there is a lot of my faith in it, but it's not Bible-thrown faith. It's just, hey, look, if this can happen to me. And when I was in sophomore in high school, I was mercifully picked on by this kid who's a boxer. And for some reason, he didn't like me. And going to school every day was absolutely, it was just like a nightmare, because then I'd come home. My mom was in a total depression. She didn't even function my sophomore year of high school. She just lived in a dark zone that's hard to describe. And then my father would come back from his trips, get drunk, and then he'd be abusive to me or to my mother. It was just, that year was a year of hell. And, believe me when I tell you, if I could have committed suicide and had the guts to, I would have. But here I am at my age, and, I'm still flying in the airlines, still a captain, had a great life. I had 5 kids, I lost one. I've got 4 that are, in fact, one of my oldest son is actually flying F-18s in the military. So, you can be really down and out and then really go up. So
that's an
that's
element
kind
of the story that you mentioned before in answering the question, who is this really designed for? Who do you hope reads the book? If you read the reviews, it touches on several levels. The flight, the aspect of that, which is very enlightening and entertaining, and the inspirational fact of this. Not everybody goes through exactly what you did, but we all have issues that we deal with. You got through these to the point of finding great success in your life, and it's interesting the evolution of your faith that we see and progress through the book, Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell by Roger Johnson, our guest on the program. Book's available, of course, at Amazon, the usual places. Time going by so quickly, but I want to talk a little bit more about this relationship with your father. Let's start because, boy, it was good, it was bad. Let's talk about the best part of being your father's son. You obviously inherited this desire to fly, military pilots, airline pilots. What was the best part of you being his son?
It's probably the finest times that my father and I had. I mean, was the era when after I went to pilot training, and when I first started flying, he was teaching me, I realized how heavenly it was. But the golden times for my father and I flying was, I went to pilot training, graduated from Air Force flight training, and I would come home and visit my father. I'd fly the military line. He had taken an airplane cross country. So I would fly home, and my dad was just so proud of having a son who was, in the military. And those were really, I'd spend 2 or 3 days at home with him. And in the entire time, we just would talk about aviation, talk about flying. And even though he would get, knee walking drunk, he was never angry, never upset. That was probably the calmest times where he and I could just totally get along. And those were the wonderful times. And I'd fly with him when he flew. He was flying in the airlines or flying as a flight test pilot with the FAA. He'd let me go on flights with him, and he'd let me fly the airplane he was flying, whether it's a 727 or a Convair 580. And because I was in the Air Force at the time, I was allowed to do that. Those times, probably the 80s, I guess, those were really good times between my father and I.
The other part of that, of course, and you've described some of these, the worst part. What was the worst part of dealing with your father, and what he was going through that put you, your mother, family members through it as well?
When I entered high school, for whatever reason, my father, I can tell you things to where the high school years and college years were the worst. I remember I was dating this girl. My dad did not like her, and he absolutely just, when I brought her to the house one time, he just berated her. And, she started crying. I had to leave. There was another time when my father said to me, I'd bring girls to the house every now and then when I was in, say, high school or college, and my father would talk to them. If he found one he liked, he would talk to them. And when she would leave, he would say, she likes me more than she likes you. And I remember one time I was dating this girl, my first wife, I will tell you right now, I was dating. He said, "You are going to marry her." And I'm like, "No, I'm not." And literally, my father, there were times he would come in at like midnight, 1 a.m. into my room, and he would slap me in the face all night. And he's like, "You're going to marry her. You're going to marry her. You're going to and I'm not making this up. I mean, you can't make this up."
No.
Those times were hell. And I had married that woman just to get my father off of my butt. I just said, and I said, and I knew I'd divorce her, and we eventually divorced, but I did it just to get him off of my butt. Turns out later in life, he was truly in love with her and was using me as, vicariously living through me to be with her. It's sick. I mean, that's the part of my father that was just very ugly.
All of this in Roger's book, Roger Johnson, our guest, the book Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell, talking about his days in aviation, difficult days growing up. Now that your father has passed away, have you changed? What's your thoughts on your father? How has all of that changed now that he's gone?
Well, the day my father died, he told me a secret, which, I'm not going to reveal here because you'll have to read the book for that.
Yes.
And that secret is what was like the aha moment for me to see, now I know. It was between him and his mother. And that secret, and he'd never told anyone except myself. Nobody. I don't even know why on that deathbed confession he told it to me. And so, and I did talk to him about Christ and going to heaven and all that. And he was never a Christian. And, he says he accepted Jesus on his deathbed. Whether that's true or not, I will find out when I die. But for me personally, after my father passed away, it was, believe it or not, it was a loss. My dad was an icon in my life. As much of a jerk as he could be, the aviation part he was a great source of knowledge and wisdom. So that part I missed, but then I had to pick up the pieces to me because I had been through couple of marriages lost a daughter. It was really difficult. In fact, when my father passed away, my mother passed away 6 months previous. I was going through a divorce, and it was a living hell then, just trying to, fly in the airlines, fly around the world, take care of 4 kids, really. 2 were in another state. But I just had to take stock of my life, and I had a kind of a nuclear meltdown one day on the layover on the West Coast. And I just thought, I have got to get my crap together, because I cannot be anything to anybody, especially my children as they're growing up, or another woman if I decide to ever marry again. So I sought help from a counselor. And, I don't know if anyone's ever been through that, but, they rip apart your life, and then they put it back together, and they say, this is that, this is this. But if anyone goes to counseling, you have to be brutally honest with them. And some of the things I had to tell her were extremely difficult. But going to the counselor, my prayer life, going to church full time, every Sunday, and reading the Bible and just talking to Christian friends, and it's not an easy process. I will tell you, there's a book out, and I don't mean to promote somebody else's book, but it's The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. And he starts out, life is difficult, something like that. And I will tell you, I didn't want life to be difficult, but as I went through, I realized in order to change, it was going to hurt. And I didn't, for years and years and years, I didn't want that pain of changing emotionally. I wanted it to be easy. And then I realized through the counselor, she said, no, you have got to experience death of certain parts of you, and it's going to hurt. But once you get through that, you will realize that on the other side, it's so much better and healthier. And she was right.
All of this in Roger's book, and boy, the time has gone by quickly here. What an amazing job he's done in putting this book together that touches so many nerves in so many people. Roger Johnson, Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell. We know you're an accomplished pilot. Finding out you're an accomplished writer as well. Are you working on another book now? You have a way of bringing us into the story that makes us feel like we're part of the journey. We're there with you. Anything you're working on now?
I am. I am about 4 chapters into a fiction book. It's going to be called Secrets, Lies, and Murder: What Really Happened on Gull Island. And actually, it's a nonfiction. It's not lighthearted, but it's going to be, it's a story about 3 pilots that have been flying Banner airplanes up and down the Jersey Shore for 3 summers, and they're on their 4th summer together, and they're going to be graduating they graduated college. At the end of the summer, they're all going in the military, and they stumble upon a very nefarious situation going on this little island that's uninhabited that they fly over every day. And the story involves them figuring out, being kind of like super sleuths, trying to figure out what is going on. And it's just full of flying, boating, scuba diving, and a lot of it's based upon things that I have done in my life back then when I was in college and high school. So it's fun for me to write. The dialogue is kind of hard for me to write at times. I have to really think I got to keep all the different people and the personalities.
I can't wait for that book. I love that. So and this is interesting because as we're laying there on the beach and we see these banners being flown across, and we're wondering who's in the pilot seat. A lot of times they're students. That's how you can make a little extra money while you're going to college.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yep.
One of the many aspects. I've done such an excellent job with Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell. Roger Johnson, our guest on the program, and you can find the book at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the usual places. If you go to our website, you can link on directly and get information. Weathering Storms, Flying Between Heaven and Hell. Roger, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us on the program. Congratulations on a job really well done with this. This is a book that will be out there and inspire and help a lot of people. And look forward to having you back to talk about the fiction book, sort of fiction book you're working on. Thank you for being with us on the program.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, and y'all have a good day.
You as well. Roger Johnson, weathering storms, flying between heaven and hell. Information on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Back on today's program after these messages.
This Week in America is online. You can visit our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Scott Pinkerton, Associate Producer of This Week in America. Jay Anderson, Segment Producer. Ben Watson, Webmaster. Otto Bechet, Director of Engineering and TV Production. This Week in America produced and is a trademark of Blue Funk Broadcasting, LLC. For information on all of our guests and to listen to this week's show, our website again at thisweekinamerica.us. And I'm Sean Bratton, Executive Producer of This Week in America.